So we know that a 2D array has two pair of square brackets when you declare the array. When you want to access an element from your 2D array, you're going to need two subscripts. So a 1D array would need one subscript, but a 2D array would need two subscripts to access an element. So the general format to access a 2D array element would be you write the array name and then the row subscript and then the column subscript. So if we work with a 1D array, we're going to use a for loop, right? However, when you work with a 2D array, you're going to need nested for loops. It means you have an inner for loop inside an outer for loop. This is an example of assigning a value to a 2D array. So let's say sales is a 2D array with row size 10 and column size 5. And then we want to assign the element at the 6th row and the 4th column with the value of 25.75. The 6th row will have the index 5 and the 4th column will have the index 3. We can write the statement as sales 53 equals to 25.75. In this example, we want to assign this pattern of numbers to a 2D array. So let us assume that we want to assign our 5 times 4 array with the pattern number shown below. So we're going to need a nested for loop for this operation. So the outer for loop will iterate through the rows and the inner for loop will iterate through the columns. And then we can assign the value of the pattern to the elements in our 2D array. So you can have the outer for loop to iterate through the rows and the inner for loop to iterate through the column. And then you can assign a value to the element one by one. So in this example here, R and C gonna start with 0, 0. So we will assign table 0, 0 equals to 0 times 10 plus 0. So that's gonna be a 0, which is this first element. And then we're gonna iterate through the inner loop first. So we increase C. C is now 1. So the next element would be table 0, 1, which means the first row and the second column here. We want the value of 1. So this is going to be 0 times 10 plus 1. So we have value 1. At the end, this nested for loop will iterate 20 times, which is 5 times 4, and assign values according to this equation to our 2D array. So this is another example of assigning values to the entire two-dimensional array. So same thing, we have a nested for loop. The outer for loop will go through the rows and the inner for loop will go through the column. So I and j will iterate from 0, 0 until 2, 1. So let's say we don't want to operate on the entire two-dimensional array. We just want to compute either a row or a column in the two-dimensional array. Then we're not going to need nested for loop. We just need a single for loop. So because now it's like we're working on a one-dimensional array. So if we look at this example, compute the average of the second row of a two-dimensional array with 3 rows and 5 columns. So let's say this is our array. It has 3 rows with 5 columns. We want to calculate the average of the values in the second row. So if you look at the codes here, it's not a nested for loop, but it's just a single for loop. So we can go through the column from column 0 until column 4. And here the rows number is fixed. It's not going to change on each iteration. So since we want to find the average of the second row has index 1. So we fix the row number as 1. So here we have the accumulator variable sum plus equal array 1 column. So 1 will be the rows, it's fixed, but column will iterate from 0 until 4. So the value of each element will be added to sum. And then to get the average, it would be sum divided by the total number of column, which is 5. When we want to print out values in two-dimensional array, since we are working on the entire array, we're going to need a nested for loop. But usually when we print out a two-dimensional array, we want it to look like a table with rows and columns. So make sure for every element in the same row, you have a white space in between the element. But between rows, you want to add a new line character so that every row is in separate lines. So let's look at this example. We have a 2D array named table. Table has the size of 5 rows and 4 columns. So this is an example of printing out a two-dimensional array. So if you look at this code, so we have a 2D array named table. It has 5 rows and 4 columns, and we initialize it with these values. So here, since we want to operate on the entire two-dimensional array, we're going to need a nested for loop. So the outer one will iterate from 0 until 4. The inner for loop will iterate from index 0 until index 3. When we print out the value of each element, we put a space in between. But after we finish one row, we want to print out a new line character. So that's why we have here coutendl, which is not inside the inner loop, but it's inside the outer loop. So there are 2 statements in the outer for loop, which is one, the inner for loop, and another one is the coutendl. Now let's write a program that asks input from user and keep it in a two-dimensional array, and then display back the user input in a table forms. So first, let's declare 2 constants for the row size and the column size. So now, since we want to operate on the entire two-dimensional array, we're going to need to use a nested for loop. First, we need to declare our two-dimensional array. And then we're going to write our nested for loops. So this nested for loop will iterate 4 times, because we have a 2 by 2 table. So the user is going to need to enter 4 values. And then we want to display back the values in a table form. So we're going to write another nested for loop, but for a cout statement. If we write it this way, without a new line character for every row, then the output will not going to be in a table form. Let's try run this program. Let's say we enter 10, 20, 30, and 40. So here's the output. These are the values of 2D array, 10, 20, 30, and 40. And it's displayed in a row, and it's not in a table form. So to display a 2D array in a table form, you need to add the new line character. It's not in the inner loop, but it's in the outer loop. So now if we run the codes, we're going to get an output in a table form. 10, 20, 30, and 40. 10 and 20 are the values in the first row. 30 and 40 are the values in the second row. Since we are using constant as our row size and column size, we can make our two-dimensional array larger with just changing the constant values. So now we can input 9 values in our two-dimensional array. So let's say we enter 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, So here is our two-dimensional array, 10, 20, 30 on one row, 40, 50, 60, and the second row, 70, 80, 90 at the third row. If we want to find the average in our 2D array, we need to keep a running total and then calculate the average of the elements. So first we need to declare an accumulator variable, let's say float sum, and also initialize the accumulator to 0, and then we can use the display nested for loop. So we need to keep a running total. Every element would be added to the sum plus table ij. So sum will have the total value of our 2D array. We also need another variable for our average. So now we can display the average. The average will be sum over the total number of elements. So the total number of elements is R size times C size. So let's enter the same number again. So here is the average of the elements in our 2D array, which is 50. So that's all we have for two-dimensional array. So array are used to operate on large amount of data. So we have learned about one-dimensional array and two-dimensional array, and what are the operations that we can do on these arrays. Thank you.